So the winter season is still in its infancy as of the time of writing this, and thus I don't really have much to say yet. Though from what I've watched so far, I suspect that'll soon change. I've gotten really strong first impressions from Mob Psycho Season 2, Dororo, The Promised Neverland, and Kaguya-sama Love is War. And there are even some less hyped shows that I may want to talk about. But along those lines, I want to talk about initial impressions again. I have already discussed them before back in summer, but that was with regard to a series in general. With this specifically, I want to look at characters. Because a first impression is powerful. It naturally shapes how you first see the character, but that impression itself is influenced by the scene and other characters, if there are any, that share the screen. Say for example the character is alone, or thinks they are, it's almost assured they're going to behave in a different manner than if they're around other people, and we may get a glimpse at that through something like an internal monologue or how they behave. There's obviously some psychology to dive into there, but for our purposes, it's more about how that presence or absence can dictate what light you first see the character in. And the same goes for all the other factors that influence the scene, like shot composition, music, and lighting. Even just a greater context for the sequence can be huge. It's incredibly cool to me how missing just some of these pieces can make the puzzle that is this character you're trying to figure out look so different. An example of this that I like to point to is Deku. Yes, I'm sure anybody who's tired of the Hiroaka discourse just let out a big sigh, but it's pertinent because he's not your stereotypical shonen protagonist. At least not compared to how I first saw him, which is my whole point. My first impression of Deku was not this sniveling child getting the crap beat out of him by his childhood friend, only to have him be branded with that same moniker of weakling and powerless throughout the first episode. No, instead, my first exposure, thanks to Rooster Teeth's fan service podcast, was this.
It rises to the surface. The most important qualification of a hero, the spirit of self-sacrifice. Look at that arm.
His arm is fucking jelly.
Now, I know it's hard because this is 4 episodes in and you've likely had a solid grasp of Deku as a character by now, but try to imagine this being your first impression of him. It's honestly really funny to me looking back at what my expectations for Deku and Hiroaka as a whole were based on this one clip, because I knew nothing else. I had no idea this was a test or why his arm was broken. I think I just assumed it was a more realistic superhero show where the characters aren't invincible. I guess I was partially right. It's so hard to describe, but he just felt like this badass typical shonen protagonist who was willing to sacrifice his body to destroy this robot. And of course he is in his own way, but it's still such a different feeling compared to the one I had when I had the context for Deku and the situation. Both are still cool, but likewise distinct. Because again, looking at it now, I even had a distorted idea of what his character design was. Because in the clip they show, he's never good broccoli boy Deku, it's 100% desperation and driven Deku, ultimately building to an almost entirely different idea of who he was thanks to the circumstance. This is no doubt an extreme and unconventional example, and it exists only because I experienced a scene in a way neither the mangaka nor director of the anime probably envisioned. But I have another example of where my first impression of a character was flipped on its head that was probably more in line with what the author intended. Leorio from Hunter x Hunter. There exists, out there, a text conversation between me and my friend back when I had first started watching the series, meanwhile she, I think, had already completed it. Anyway, as you can see, I wasn't exactly fond of the guy at the outset. I hadn't even bothered to spell his name correctly. But it was true. Between the likes of Gon, Kurapika, and eventually Killua, Leorio became easily the most dislikable at first glance. Someone who was stubborn to a fault and seemingly taking the hunter exam only for monetary and personal gain? On top of that, he ends up being the guy that acts before he thinks and gets himself and others into trouble because of it. Leorio is designed as a character that you need to warm to. That said, it doesn't take long, as by the end of the first handful of episodes we learn his actual reason for wanting to be a hunter, and by the end of the first arc he's willing to stand up for Killua, offering to be disqualified in his stead for Killua's actions. It's not as if his personality has changed all that much, we've just grown accustomed to his unique brand of charm in step with the rest of the group. And this carries through to future arcs like Yorknu and especially the election, the former being probably a near-perfect reintroduction for him as it plays to his strengths as a more idea-oriented guy. Likewise, his first appearance is one of legitimate helpfulness, aiding Gon and Killua in their decision on a new phone. Sure, it's a small gesture, but one that reminds us of the light we should see him in now. in case his other eccentricities left a stronger impression on our minds during his absence. And as we see in the interactions between the trio that follows, those idiosyncrasies are still present, but they feel right at home with the driving force behind their half of this arc. Money. Leorio proves to be no slouch, making an impact within a day of reuniting with Gon and Killua by spreading the word of the former's strength. And their underground arm wrestling venture might have actually gotten the job done had plans outside their control not been set in motion. The election arc, meanwhile, reinforces the quality in Leorio that, at least for me, made me see him differently. His fierce sense of loyalty. That same burning passion that got him in trouble all the way back during the Hunter exam, now earning him a massive amount of acclaim, both from his peers, and I'd be lying if I didn't say me as well. And the natural levity he brings with him is especially welcoming during an arc where the other primary source of that liveliness is incapacitated. I'd argue that's why he was needed most during the election from a tonal standpoint. All of this built to the point where he became one of my favorite characters in Hunter x Hunter. Easily one of the biggest 180s I've done on any character in any medium. And in going back to rewatch some of Leorio's initial antics, it's interesting how different a feeling I get from him. Yes, he is still rough around the edges, but there's an underlying sense of authenticity to his actions. He does his best to seem cool, but unlike everyone else in his initial party, he's easily flustered and very much wears his heart on his sleeve when push comes to shove. In that sense, he's one of the more flawed and human characters that we meet early in the series, or at the very least, he's the easiest to spot. And through this lens, much more of his loyal and goofball self shine through and he becomes far more likable. At least, to me, he did. But that's just my experience. I still find it incredibly interesting just how much the blank slate that is a new character can be colored by a vast number of factors, even if you're seeing them first in a way the original creator didn't intend. And this part is mainly my own speculation, but I could see those factors extending even beyond the source material or adaptations to things like fanfics or art. I guess it'll depend on how much you do or don't like what said fanwork is saying about the character or series in question, but I know I've seen fan art from Hiroaka, Hunter x Hunter, Zombieland Saga, and numerous other series that's only made me love these characters and shows more. But those are just my thoughts, and as always, I'd love to hear what you have to say. What's a character whose initial impression ended up being completely different from how you saw them in the end? Doesn't have to mean they became your favorite or even that you ended up liking them, just that it wasn't the same as how you expected them to be. Also, let me know what shows from this season you'd like to see a video on first. I feel a little spoiled for choice and could use some help with what to focus on. Any and all additional comments are welcome down below. Thank you so much for watching, and an especially big thanks goes out to my awesome patrons, PenguinPandaZero, OverjoyedSoup, MVPino, James Morton, Mr. Idealist, Marbled Ranger, Spudge, Beorn, and everyone else whose support helps make videos like these possible. Links to that Patreon if you'd like to join them, my shirts, and everything else are either down below or on the screen right now. Leave a like and click that bell icon to keep up to date. Stay awesome, and I'll see you next time.